Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Pamela Dellal, the director of the Emanuel Music Bach Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our penultimate public event of our really amazing Bach Institute that we've had this month. Today we will be talking about Cantata BWV 72, Alles nur nach Gottes Willen, the cantata which will be performed tomorrow in the church service with the lead roles taken by our magnificent Institute fellows. I also want to confirm and announce that our showcase concert, which is scheduled for Sunday evening, tomorrow evening, it will go on as scheduled on Sunday evening. We know there is snow. We go ahead anyway. I mentioned this because we have been announcing that we were holding a snow date, and so some of you in our audience might have wondered if the snow date would go into effect. We are going to keep the concert on Sunday evening, the 19th, but be aware that we are live streaming, so if you have any concerns about getting into Emanuel, you will still be able to access the program. But we would love to see you in person. So with that, I'm going to take a seat. Don't need to do all of this standing. And I love when a cantata like this comes up in the Bach Institute, because it's really such a fascinating piece. The structure of it, the variety of textures, and just the sort of creativity. We're every week saying, we've never seen this before from Bach, you know. And I'd like to kick things off by taking a look at the libretto. This piece was written a little bit later in Bach's time in Leipzig. It was written in January of 1726. That puts it in the third Jahrgang, which is a cycle of cantatas of which many pieces have been lost, which is quite unfortunate. But we also know that at this point, some of the tremendous creative urgency that he had in the first 2 years was beginning to change its focus. So the type of experimentation that we see Bach doing in the third Jahrgang is somewhat different than, say, in the big chorale cantata year. Another interesting feature of the text here, of course, you know, if you've become accustomed to expecting to see a chorale in the opening movement, we do not have that. But the libretto is actually a libretto from his wonderful librettist from Weimar, Salomo Frank. Most of the libretti that we have from this poet were set when Bach was in Weimar, and they have a very particular character. They're usually more chamber-like. But it appears from this that Bach took some of these libretti with him into Leipzig, and when he had the opportunity, he was able to create a work with the collaboration of Frank, but with several years removed from their partnership. I have been particularly struck in the way that Bach deals with this particular question. We did talk about the fact that there's no chorale in the opening movement, but the chorale that ends the cantata is a real bedrock of Lutheran faith. And Bach used this very text and this very tune, I think it was 5 or 6 times in the course of it. This is a chorale that he came to. And 9.
I think not, well, I'm not sorry to correct you. I think it was 9 times, including it's in the Passion.
In the Passions, yeah.
And in the Christmas oratory as well.
So, was mein Gott will, das geschehe allzeit. Whatever God wills, intends, always happens, right? So the opening text of the cantata, everything according to God's will, is obviously very tightly linked to the message of this chorale. So we have a list of various experiences that we have in our lives, joy and sorrow, good times, bad times, clouds and sunshine, right? All of these things. And then this idea of a litany, the litany being a repetitive phrase that is woven through a large form. We think of like the great litany that starts the season of Lent, which has a number of short responses that are said over and over and over again. It feels like a very ritualistic, like a Catholic form. What Zalamo Frank has created here is not just one litany, but several litanies. So we'll talk a little bit more about the way that Bach brings out the musical structure, but this idea of everything, alles, 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 is omnipresent in the opening chorus. As you heard in the rehearsal, the second movement, which was the arioso for the alto, has an even more prominent litany where the line, Herr, so du willst, Lord, as you will, occurs 9 times. And each time with a different consequent phrase. So this idea of prayer and the sense of exacting a particular kind of ritual to both connect the soul to God, but also, as we'll discuss, trying to bring the soul into alignment with this idea is really strongly emphasized. Then the alto aria, which follows, continues this idea of comparing the good and the bad, right? So we have the Dornstrassen and the Rosenstrassen. So we have the thorny paths and the rosy paths. Either way, I'm going to cleave to God's will. And then finally, really the turning point of the cantata is at that moment where the bass recit comes in and says, now we believe it. Now we can really accept this. God is going to take care of things as we have seen, right? And then finally, the soprano aria seems to finally relax in its affect after all of this sort of screwing our courage to the sticking point, as it were, in I will let God take care of things. So with that sort of quick walkthrough of the libretto, I'm going to turn it over to Ryan, and we can sort of see how Bach brings out these ideas in the music.
Thank you, Pam. Before we even talk about the music, I just want to speak a little bit about what was happening in Bach's life at this time. So 1726, you mentioned the libretto by Zalamo Frank. It comes from a volume of sacred poetry called Evangelisches Andachtsopfer, and it was written in 715. In 1723, Bach moves to Leipzig to become the cantor at the Thomaskirche. 1725, in the fall of 1725, Zalamo Frank died. So when this cantata was written, we see what happens in 1726. He turns to a lot of Frank text. It's almost as though he's remembering his old friend. So Frank had passed away when this cantata was written. The other thing that I think is interesting to note is this is about the time, in Bach's time in Leipzig, when he had grown increasingly frustrated with the church hierarchy and the government hierarchy. And in fact, right the week before this cantata was written, he penned a letter to the Elector of Saxony. He went beyond the church hierarchy, went all the way to the Elector of Saxony to complain about the way he and the musicians were being paid. In fact, he was being at this time asked to, in addition to his duties at the Thomaskirche and the Nikolaikirche, they asked him and were making him do services at the university church, the Paulinerkirche, as well. And he wasn't being compensated for it. And he hadn't been heard. So he was really, it's interesting to me, not only was he frustrated, but he also turned to his friend Frank again. So I feel like there's, inherent in this cantata, in this text, also is Bach maybe saying to himself, everything according to God's will. It's going to be okay. We're going to get through this sort of stormy passage. Of course, after that, he experiences over the next 2 years, 3 years, incredible sorrow and grief in his life as he loses a number of children, either at birth or I think one of his children died at the age of 1.5. So he and his wife, went through a very tumultuous time, and I don't think it's any coincidence that the end of this third Jahrgang in 1726 was when he stopped writing cantatas on the same normal weekly basis. And then he ended up just sort of filling in some of the cycle and focusing more on his work with the Collegium Musicum, and I think where he felt like he could rely on the level of musicianship around him. So, putting it in that context. The other thing that is, this is a cantata for the third Sunday after Epiphany, and the gospel reading of that day is about the cleansing of the leper and the healing of the centurion's paralyzed son. And in that gospel reading, there is the phrase, Lord, if thou wilt, please heal my son. Lord, if thou wilt, please cleanse this leper. This sort of litany that we see happening in the alto recitative, Herr, so du wilt. And we hear it sung 9 times. So it's all, the framework, as so often is the case with Bach, has been set up before a single note has been written. So I think it's helpful to hear that entire context. If you have a chance to read, I joked with Pam, I said, I don't have much to say other than to tell you all to read Pam's notes, because they're really fantastic and incredibly thoughtful and thorough. But one thing struck me, and I'm going to kind of jump around, in the final chorale, Pam talks about this tension or duality between A minor and C major that's inherent. And I think that's the tension in the entire cantata. It's encapsulated in this chorale tune that oscillates back and forth. And we have, if you recall in the rehearsal, the penultimate phrase ends in this very solid, firm C major. It's like, we've arrived, but it's not over. He takes us back in the realm of A again. And the opening chorus begins in A, and we have these moments of tension, harmonic tension throughout the entire piece. I could go through the whole thing, but I think to me, one of the stunning things about the opening chorus is sort of about the midway point. And I know we don't have scores in front of us, but it feels like there's this storm, in a way. We're being tossed about, and the text is everything according to God's will, and the mantra or litany, alles, 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 it keeps coming back. And I do feel there's this sense of the believer holding on tightly in a storm, or, on the tee, holding on, you're standing and you don't know how, there's that feeling to it. And then the storm calms and the text changes, and it's at measure 61, but Gottes Wille soll mich stillen. God's will shall calm me. And it's, to me, the most magical moment. And in the rehearsal, we stopped and we worked it again, and I asked the choir, don't let the sound bloom. No crescendo. Just let the harmonies work for you. And what I think makes it so incredibly successful, one is that there's no bloom on the sound, and you allow Bach's music to create the expression. And what Bach does here, it's 15 measures of 7 chords. Every single chord is a 7 chord. And that's where he creates this sense of tension and calm at the same time. And then it's I've often used this image of shaking a champagne bottle or shaking a seltzer or a Coke and not opening it. And then we break free. We finally get back to the dominant. And the basses talk about this is being among the clouds, Beigewerk, and there's Beigewerk, and there's this storm that's brewing. And it takes us back into the A material again. You look like you want to add to that.
Well, I just think in our work this week, with all of our other repertoire, which of course we will excited to share with you on Sunday, we found ourselves again and again talking about how Bach is able to dramatize the human experience. You might be searching for an answer, and then the answer comes, but you're still on the way. And so the troubles come back. And I think this is another one of those moments that we feel ourselves at peace. God's will calm me. But instead of just saying, yeah, in clouds or sunshine, it's like, no, we really experience the turmoil coming again.
And I also, we talk about Bach and society and community, and it just struck me what I found interesting about, it feels almost like a modified da capo form in a way. And we bring back this very similar material, but it's different because we get rid of a lot of the 16th notes. We're just saying, alles nur nach Gottes Willen, over and over again. But the altos aren't on board. They're doing something different. They're almost like the lost sheep that's gone astray, or the member of the community that is needing to be guided back in their path. But Bach allows them. And I think there's this wonderful nurturing thing where they're buttressed by the community still singing Alles nur, this mantra, this litany that keeps coming back convincing, and they finally come back on track. But not completely, because we get to, this is sort of what I consider almost like the coda, and the Alles comes back again, but the altos, we think they're back on track, but they just can't be completely on track, and they throw in this major 7. And singers, if you're orchestra players, if you're looking at measure 99. And this is a point in the, just so you know the thought process, at this moment we decided, we'd always done alles and made the last syllable short. And at this moment I decided, no, we needed to be long, alles. And so that the alto G sharp against the A could sort of pierce the texture. I don't know if any of that reaches the congregation, but I think it does to us. And there is this sort of headlong nature to it that it doesn't end, really end. We get to, it resolves back in the home key, but this time in major. So there is a sense of arrival, but I do believe inherent in all of this A is that we feel there's a C major somewhere in our future.
The last thing I would add is just that passage that Ryan was just talking about. It's a parallel to something earlier in the movement where the sopranos sort of take off with the, they sing So bei Lust, auf Traurigkeit, whereas the rest of the chorus is still chanting alles, alles, alles. I think what's striking is, we are accustomed to the sopranos having a sort of being set apart because often that is the chorale tune and they do their own thing. So the texture there seems very, I don't want to say predictable in a negative way, but sort of like, yes, this makes sense that this we're here. It is more surprising when Bach creates this parallel and puts that action into the alto voices. And what he gives them to sing is not the text from the opening, but the text of the end of the movement. Also, there's a sense of call and response. The preacher saying, you need to believe, and everyone says, we believe, or, amen, yes, or something like that. The opening movement to me is dramatic in almost an operatic way. Again, he gives us this sense of how in the moment we need to hold these words in our heart and how we have to work to bring ourselves, like I said before, into alignment with them.
And harmonically, he's doing that as well. In the rehearsal with upstairs, we have our rehearsal with just the choir up here first, and we did it at tempo, straight through it, and it was okay. There were some problems, and we slowed everything down. And I think the struggle that you're talking about is in what's happening harmonically. It's so incredibly thorny and unpredictable, and there are turns that we had to stop and say, wait a second, is that right? let's tune that chord and really make sure. And I think that's one of the way he's portraying the struggle, not just for the listener, but for the performer.
Yes.
Trying to figure out how do we make these harmonies work. And one solution, of course, would be, and I joked with Brett, our rehearsal pianist, I said, we really should just do this once really slowly so that the congregation hears it. We're going to do a rehearsal tempo once, and then we'll repeat it. But I mean, that is one solution, but I think the challenge, too, is how do we make these harmonies make sense at this breakneck speed? Because it does really feel it's that sort of holding on tight in the middle of a storm.
The last thing, I've known this cantata for many years and I adore it, but something that came up last week when we were talking to John about Cantata 123, and we were talking about how many different approaches could have been possible. And I think this cantata can really open up our thinking, because if you just read the libretto, everything according to God's will, in joy as in sorrow, in good times as in bad, God will call me. And you had no reference to what Bach does. You could imagine an entirely different musical setting, something that's very serene, that's very assured, comforting even. And in the light of that, it's actually quite surprising that the chorus is so full of turmoil, that there's so much dissonance and struggle in it. It's not, I think, the way one would imagine a text like this to be set.
And it certainly is not what the church was used to before Bach. I mean, Bach's predecessor, I can only imagine, Johann Kuhnau, the way he would have set this sort of, piacevole, this pleasing, delightful, everything according to God's will. I think it's Bach, we often call him the fifth evangelist, sort of tongue-in-cheek, but it's his way of trying to get, I think, his listener, the congregation, to look at this text in a different way and to bring to light the challenges of this journey.
I have a term that I sometimes use for that. I call it aspirational text setting. In other words, the setting of the music is saying, I want to be in this place, but I'm not there yet. I think we see that here, and I think we will see again as we get to the alto aria a similar kind of sense of trying to. It's really hard to just let go of my own desires, my own sense of what I think I need to do, and say I'm going to put it in God's hands. It's hard to do, and I cannot think of another composer who shows us that in musical terms as well as Bach does. The way that we can see the answers, but we haven't reached them yet. And I think once you realize that this is a level at which Bach functions, you can find examples of it in many, many places.
And he does that harmonically, as I mentioned, to get us to this alto aria, that alto business we're about to talk about. So we end in this brilliant A major, and it does feel a little bit like, salvation, we've been saved. But there's still something unsettling about that A major. And we talked about the inherent tension between A major, or any A, and C. And the next downbeat is, we think, we did it. C major. And the alto says nope, because she throws in a 7, and suddenly it's a secondary dominant. It could have, instead of an octave leap, gives us the 7th, even though she's saying, oh, blessed. But there's always, I always think about Pam where it's she talks about looking at the incarnation and the birth through the lens of the passion, and that the struggle is always present in the beauty. And in this alto aria, it definitely is, alto recitative, it is definitely the case. There is a litany that goes throughout this entire alto recitative, a little arioso thing. Herr, so du wilt, Lord, as you will. I try not to get too caught up in the numerology of Bach, but this one I find hard to escape. And that is that he says it 9 times. And of course, we know the Trinity, 9 divided by 3, all that symbolism there. But the other thing is that every single phrase is of an odd length, but the same length. 5 measure phrases. You don't find a 5 measure phrase in Bach that often. And if you do find it, you definitely don't find 5 measure phrase after 5 measure phrase, the consistency and regularity in which he does it. So he does this 9 times, and there's only one of the phrases that does not begin with Herr, so du wilt. And the text when he says that is, und meine Seele stillen, and my soul will quiet.
I need to jump in here because this is a particular moment in this movement that I think is easy to miss. So I hope if you're looking at your librettos, we have this, Herr, so du wilt, this will happen. Lord, as you will, this will happen, this will happen. When he gets to the 8th statement, you see the dash, Herr, so du wilt, lass mich dies Wort im Glauben fassen und meine Seele stillen. So I don't think this is his own phrase. I think this is a continuation of, suddenly he breaks the pattern. But what I see here is that this litany, we've just been saying, Lord, as you will, Lord, as you will, and suddenly these words become an object. Lord, as you will, I need to keep these words in my soul. So there's a parenthetical sort of interruption, as instead of just saying, Lord, as you will, let me do this, it's Lord, as you will. That's the thing I need to remember. And that is incredibly striking because he's not done yet, because there's one more after that, right? So it almost dramatizes again that very intimate, sort of personal, prayerful way that you say a word over and over until it turns into an object. And it literally does at that moment. And then the last statement, Herr, so du wilt, so sterb ich nicht. As a non-Christian, I think the first time I saw this, it didn't really register. Yes, we're expecting to be in the afterlife, right? But there's a lot of talk in Bach about death, about accepting death, understanding death as a passage to the next life. But this statement is so blatantly as if we're going to erase the concept of death completely. Really, I think surprising, even theologically. I'm just not going to die at all. But then with the way Bach sets this is even more extraordinary because we've gotten used to, in the course of this movement, the very beautiful lyrical dialogue between the voice and the cello, voice and the continuo. But here, as soon as the singer is beginning to sing this, So sterb ich nicht, the continuo drops into a pedal tone, and it becomes highly chromatic, very tortured. The voice is sinking lower and lower and lower on the word die. And then at the very end of the phrase, leaps back and up an octave and says, not. I'm not going to do it. I am not going to die. And the vividness of that setting in the context of something that we almost fell into a sense of complacency. Okay, I can see how this movement is going to go, like one would if you were reciting a mantra over and over. As much as you're trying to concentrate on it, your mind might start to wander, right? And in any kind of meditative practice, one knows that you've been derailed and you need to bring yourself back. And I think there is something going on in this passage where twice we're brought back by something that is so striking that we haven't sort of, gotten into our own pattern of thinking because we know what's going to come next. We don't know what's going to come next when we say, let me keep these words in my heart and my faith. And then we don't know what's going to happen when we say, so sterbe ich nicht. And of course, that then really breaks the pattern because the arioso ends and there's a recitative. We started with a recit, now we end with a recit, which ends on a very pregnant 5 chord. And then I have always been sort of amazed by what happens next. If you're following a typical libretto, you say, oh, okay, an aria is coming. But if you were just listening and you didn't have that context, the singer goes on and she's singing with the continuo, and you might think it's just the same movement. We're still doing the same thing. We had a little interruption, now we're going to go back, do more litany with everything that I have and I am. It's the biggest shock when the violins come in. It's, again, he's dramatizing this sense of being in the middle of things and not preparing. I can think of one other aria, that beautiful aria from Cantata 7. Right, where the alto begins alone and then the strings come in. But it's pretty unusual for an aria to start without the obbligato instruments playing. Usually the aria begins instrumentally and then the singers come in, and that's typical. But here we have just the singer and continuo, and then suddenly we have these violins come in and the whole sense of the texture changes because of this alto aria. So it's really quite extraordinary how Bach uses this litany and brings us into this final sort of wrapping up the energy of the opening movement, in fact.
Also, one of the unique things in this aria, so often we're used to hearing, as Pam mentioned, an instrumental ritornello that in a way introduces the melodic material that the singer is going to sing. And we talk a lot about in our coachings and with the orchestra, I always ask the orchestra to play the text, to be thinking the inflection of the text in their playing that the singer is going to sing. Well, it's turned around this time because the singer begins it. And then the fascinating thing to me is in this opening gesture that the violins have, they get material that the singer has not sung yet. And it's almost as though the violins have convinced the singer to do the material. They go bum 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 bottom, this octave leap that then resolves down a half step. And we hear it a bunch of times in the violins, and it's not until the singer's second entrance that she sings that material. It's just things turned around a little bit in that situation there. The other thing that I find interesting is when in the second half of the aria, which looks like it would be like a B section, the text here, "Er führe mich nur immerhin auf Dorn und Rosenstraßen." He leads me always through thorny paths and rosy paths, which you mentioned, and that the violins depict the different paths. The first violin hovers on this beautiful dolce high C, which of course I see as the blooming rose, the rosy path, but at the same time, the second violin is going the thorny path. And it's like the bird that gets stuck on your clothing, you can't get off. And they're tossed about, and then they trade. So to me, that's fascinating. And it's this idea that these two ideas always coexist, no matter what. They're always living together. And that makes the journey of faith, and this is so difficult, and this is how Bach musically shows us this.
Another aspect of the aria, and I'm sure those of you who were listening were feeling this, is like, wait, it's hard to hear the singer here because there's so much activity in a register that's higher than where she's singing. And, these are musical problems that often it's wonderful, I think, to watch a rehearsal and to see how a conductor and an ensemble solves them. But I feel that this moment and some of the moments coming up in the soprano aria also represent something else. I think that Bach often will create this sort of thing to make the audience work harder. If you were listening and feeling like you were having some trouble hearing, you lean in, you focus more. Can I hear what she's saying? Can I hear what's happening in her part right now? I think he does a lot of that on purpose. It's partly to dramatize that perhaps the singer is becoming overwhelmed by the forces in the world. And it's partly Bach breaking the fourth wall, as I sometimes say. He's making you lean in and participate in what's happening instead of just handing you something that's easy to understand and easy to hear, and you can just sit back and say, isn't that lovely? These musicians are so good. It's such beautiful music. He doesn't want you to think those things. He wants you to think, wow, living is hard. Making these commitments are hard. I feel invested in this. The next time you find yourself listening and you're thinking to yourself, where is the singer? I can't hear the singer. Notice how your attitude has changed. And I really attribute that intent to the composer there. I think he's doing that to us on purpose.
So after this incredible alto aria with sort of dueling violins, and it does have this feeling of, I think Pam mentioned this in our rehearsal, that it's sort of one person, meaning the alto, against the world. And how did, we finally get to this D minor cadence, and then it leads us into a bass recitative. And we were in rehearsal, I was trying to convince Anthony, our BI bass, to really embody, almost be like the voice of God, or something that's coming down from on high, saying, now you can believe. You know this is true. You made it through the storm. Now do this, believe. And I was asking the continuo to give more sound, etc. So this little recitative, he says, then believe now. Your Savior says, I will do it. And again, we get this Ich will's tun, another almost litany idea that comes back. And he plants the seed for the soprano aria, because that's her, mein Jesus will ich tun, my Jesus will do it. So we hear this little bit of text, and it's in quotes in the recitative. You want to say anything about this text?
Of the bass recitative?
Yes. It really is the turning point.
It's absolutely the turning point, and the reason why it's the turning point is because we have the Heiland, the Savior. This surprisingly was missing from the first three movements. If you scan the text, you see the word Christ and you think, oh, there he is, right? But that word does not mean Christ, it means Christian. It's talking to the human soul. Oh, blessed Christian, who can actually accept this. So the Christian, the person who's telling themselves, do according to God's will, let God's will dominate, has been saying all of this almost on their own, right? I'm alone against the world. I have to make myself accept what's happening. And now, finally, the bass says, it's okay because Jesus will do it. And this sense of relief, the sense of, okay, like imagine that you're hopefully not experiencing tomorrow, driving through a terrible snowstorm, and you're gripping the steering wheel with all your might and peering through the windshield trying to see, and then suddenly, you reach your rest stop, or maybe, somebody steps in and does the driving for you, and you're like, I'm safe now. I think that it's that kind of experience when we finally get this message that we don't have to do it all on our own, right? Again, I think the drama of how he kind of sustains this sense of tension through 3 entire long movements before he finally says, actually, it's not on you, it's on God. And let me show you how. And I think that exactly, and then he reminds us of all the tender care. The bass rest, it has just so much love in it. If you're frightened by suffering and sorrow, he knows that, and he will release those bonds. He doesn't scorn or despise the poor little huts, the people who live in poverty, and he will enter even there, right? So being God and having perfect will, his will is to be with humanity, and that's what this recit says.
And then when he does musically in this next soprano aria, there's Bach, always the master of so many levels. He gives us a C major aria in 3, and it's a polonaise, a very familiar dance form, and he writes it. Pam talked about this a little bit in the coaching we had earlier in the week, and I just want to expound upon it a little bit. Bach was getting a ton of criticism that his music was too chromatic, too thorny, not pleasing to the ear, too many notes. We could go on and on. And so he says, fine, I'll write something pretty. He writes a C major aria, a friendly key, mostly diatonic. He writes a polonaise, a dance that his congregation probably would have known. It's beautiful. It's like a grazioso piacevole. It's like a warm blanket on a cold Sunday afternoon in 18th century Leipzig. Was wrapped around the congregation. But when he writes in this quasi-galant style, it's not just pleasing or just pretty music. There's so many layers he digs in deep and finds, and when we look at the B section, well, a few things happen. He still weaves in ideas he had earlier, musically speaking. And we talked about this litany or mantra that seems to be present in every sort of concerted movement. In the first movement, alles, that keeps coming back, and back. In the alto recitative, Herr, so du wilt, Herr, so du wilt, in many different forms, keeps coming back. In the alto aria, pop, 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 that pop, beep, 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 that octave leap that descends a half step. That's the litany, the mantra that comes back. In this soprano aria, we get bum, 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 bum. It comes back in so many forms. And if you listen, the orchestra is playing a text of will es tun. I will es tun, saying that over again, the words of the bass recitative before. Jesus will do it. And he puts this in an instrumental fashion, and it just keeps coming back and coming back. And then when you look at what feels like a B section of the text, we've got this glorious G major, these beautiful suspensions and syncopations, and the soprano soloist, especially the way Rachel sings it, sort of just floats above all of this. In the middle section, obgleich dein Herz liegt in viel Bekümmernissen, although your heart lies in many troubles. He reminds us it's not all easy. There is trouble, changes the key, there are darker colors. This is one of those spots that Pam referred to about he makes it a little harder to hear the singer, the many troubles. And that's a spot where you have to lean in and listen. Intentionally puts the soprano lower in her range, quite low in fact, amidst a busy texture. This texture we hear a lot also is bum-be-da-da-da-dum, bum-be-da-da-da-dum. Michael Beatty, our principal keyboard player and artistic administrator in one of our rehearsals this week called it a mechanical clock.
Yeah.
Bum, bee-da-da-da-dum, bum. That is present throughout, the sort of ticking of a clock. And that gets even murkier when the soprano's low in her range. But she comes out of it. We listen closely, she comes out of it on the text, yet it will rest gently and softly in his arms. And it takes us to this glorious fermata that's like, the best thing I can tell you is like putting your head on a pillow at the end of a long, exhausting day.
That drive in the snowstorm.
Yes, exactly. And you just relax into it. And at the end of that, we get the A material that comes back, and it comes back with this, it's almost like the shackles have been released, and there's this sense of just, the believer's untethered at the end, and it leads us to this glorious C major. And we get this final ritornello, we think it's over. But Bach does something that we discussed this. I'd only know of one other thing perhaps that he's done this wonderful little effect he does at the soprano aria, where the soprano has this final statement of the text. Mein Jesus will es tun, my Jesus will do it, my Jesus will do it. And she says it twice, and it slows down, and we get what we call a plagal cadence, which is a 4-to-1, which is the same cadence as we know of Amen. And the soprano gets the final word. The only other time I'm aware of Bach doing something like this, but slightly different, is in Cantata 106, the Actus Tragicus. There's this middle movement, and the soprano has this moment where she gets the final word, but everything else drops out, and it just sort of evaporates. Perhaps there's another moment in the 200 cantatas that I'm not remembering, but to me this is truly unique.
I definitely think it's very, very rare for the singer to end if it's not like an arioso type of piece. I don't know, again, the surprise of not knowing what's coming. When you hear the opening material come back, you think, yes, this is the end. The orchestra always finishes. And she comes back in. It's such a surprise, right? Not only that, but the texture changes, and there are these beautiful, secure, low Cs as a pedal. And then, I was just thinking, the fact that it's a plagal cadence, so we've been talking about A minor and C, and this sort of interplay between these two keys that don't want to settle. And what happens here is it's the B flat that she brings in. That's actually an echo of that opening measure of the alto recit. Chris, and now she sings, and here's Bach doing something that we often associate with composers of a later era. I'm thinking more like Beethoven, Mozart. The use of the flat side of the key, which is this 4, this F major, to actually stabilize the C. Instead of pushing back up into something more energetic, like a dominant, what we have with this flat is it doesn't destabilize the C, it actually confirms it. And when we finally get to the final note after she sings this beautiful high A, sort of ecstatic moment, my Jesus will do it. And by the time we get to the end, the C just rumbles into place as if we have now found our home. And honestly, even though the chorale is ambiguous in its key, I think that C is so firm that the chorale, I think we perceive it as being in C. We start in 6, right? He sort of, C wins the battle in this cantata, I think.
The cantata concludes with this very The cantata then leads us to this very sort of steadfast community proclamation or declamation of faith. And I have nothing else to say to you. That was a lot.
I just want to point out one really interesting thing about this chorale text, and then we'll love to take questions. this text and this chorale were really beloved by Lutherans, but also by Bach. And there's this interesting line where hilft aufs Not der fromme Gott. He gives aid in need, this righteous God, and punishes with measure, which is kind of a little sort of dark twist to this text. And we don't really want to think about being punished when we're what we just left with all of this warm security. There's another version of this line, and comforts without measure. Und Trost den Welt ohne Maßen. So his comfort is, measureless, right? And I've always found it very interesting that, a composer of this tradition could choose which one of these versions of that line they want to use. And if you go through, because there's so many versions of it, you will find both of those. So he's either comforting or he's punishing. So I think we've rounded off, and I would love to open up the dialogue to those of us here. Do we have a handheld for our... So the first question is all the way in the back.
Hello? Hello?
You're good.
Just, okay. So I'm, I guess for people who have not been here this past week, I'm Nick. I'm one of the Bach Institute Fellows, and I play trumpet. And so I'm actually playing trumpet in the final chorale of this cantata tomorrow. And we were sort of talking about it. I was sort of talking about it with Pam a little bit ago in the rehearsal, but I guess I'm wondering more generally too, because of that. So this piece doesn't call for a trumpet. So I guess I am kind of curious, how precious is orchestration and instrumentation in this time, and maybe specifically within Bach and his church?
Good question, Nick. Yeah, so this is our first time having a trumpet in the Bach Institute, and we're we're excited that we have Nick with us. And the two cantatas that we scheduled I scheduled last June, before we knew we were going to have a trumpet player. And neither of them had cantatas. So Nick, to his credit, took the initiative and asked, can I play the final chorale? Even though Bach didn't write a trumpet in this piece. And I said, sure, why not? I like to think Bach was flexible and practical, and I think inherent in a job that he had, in which he had to prepare a cantata every week for 2 different churches, sometimes 3 different churches, and not always sure what level of playing or singing he was going to have. And I'm sure he encountered numerous instances of illness where he had to make changes. And there are so many examples we have in the cantata literature of the chorale tune being supported by some sort of brass instrument. So I don't know if that really answers your question, other than to say, we also have so many examples in the cantata literature where he changed the instrumentation from one performance to the next. And that's all that we have documented. I have to believe that there were times that, a corno di caccia was not available or was sick, but the viola was doubling the part, so he did without it, or maybe he added a different instrument to it. So I'm perfectly fine with it. And I have to say, you gave me an idea. I really like the trumpet on this. Maybe we should keep it next time we do it, because it really does. So often in these chorales, they're voiced low for the sopranos. And so when you ask a soprano to sing, to carry the melody and the text, it's a big burden, and it's sometimes a big ask. It was easier for the boys, I think, lower in their voices to make more noise, because he wouldn't have been using mature female sopranos. These would have been young boys, and many of them probably singing the chorale tune. So adding, in this case, a trumpet, an instrument to that line, what it does is it helps carry the tune so that the singers can think more about the text.
Any other questions?
Can you hear me? It's not so much a question, a strange comment, but it occurred to me sitting here and having just, of course, heard 123 last week. How common is it for Bach to come up and as you try to do that with a motif or something, we sometimes label it a brainworm or something, you can't get it out of your head. That opening of 123 or of this cantata, or maybe some for just the BSO doing the Fifth Symphony, these motifs. So with 123, I went out all week long, couldn't get that out of my head. So now I start working on this opening measure. I can't get it out of my head because I listened to it a lot. How much is Bach writing in such a way to make sure these things stay in your head?
Well, let me say, what composer wouldn't want that?
Pardon?
I think that some of the most interesting conversations we have during the Bach Institute, and one of the great joys of having the luxury to do this, is we get to sort of ask questions like this and turn them around and come back to them a couple days later and things like that. And I think that, Bach demands a lot, both of his performers and of his audiences, of his listeners. And any tool that he can use that will grab your attention. So it might be, the sort of surprising juxtaposition of confident words and troubled music. Or it might be, oh, I can't hear the singer, I have to lean in and listen harder. All of these tools he's using. And I think, like any good composer, if you got a hook, you got an earworm, it's going to pay dividends. So I think we think of Bach's music as being complex, but I think those spectacular melodies and those spectacular motives are I can't imagine that it's not deliberate and that he's not knowing the effect of them. Of course.
Hi, my name is Adam Bros. I'm a cellist fellow here this year. My question, it takes a little bit of setup, but we mentioned in the beginning of this this panel about the criticism that Bach was receiving. Well, it was actually more towards the middle of the panel, but the criticism he was receiving from some people, some of his listeners, and I'm guessing some of the people that were paying him, about his overly chromatic writing and how it was getting complicated. We make things that are pleasing to the ear. So he was clearly receiving feedback on his writing, and it also made me think about the text of 72 and also the text of other ones we've done. We're doing 10 on Sunday as well. And there's writing in here that is relating to his personal life in very key ways. This idea of, make it through, trusting God, and how that turmoil in his life that came after he was writing 72, but also predated and was happening in his life with his work and everything, is influencing his writing on a sacred thing, these cantatas. I'm wondering if this feedback that he was getting would have been encouraging him or discouraging him from including more secular things, secular aspects of his life, or if that was something that he was doing that was maybe encouraged by those that were in charge. I'm wondering if this was something that maybe he was sneaking in relevant topics. I'm thinking about the fourth movement of BWV 10 that's very political in its meanings, and I'm wondering, is this something that is being encouraged, or if maybe he was being kind of against the grain with those that were in charge?
That's a multi-level question and a really marvelous one. I'm going to try to answer some sides of that, and I'll let Ryan pick it up too. What I want to start with is, we were talking about how this was written in the third Jahrgang and that he was revealing more and more frustration with his superiors and with constraints that he felt he had. And one of the results of that is that he was spending more creative energy with the collegium, and that meant that he was writing more instrumental music, maybe more harpsichord concertos and things like that. And he was writing a certain kind of secular cantata. Throughout his life, he wrote secular cantatas, most of which we don't hear very often. And some of them were meant for a single occasion and would be put away and never heard again. Things like a birthday message for Prince Leopold, or the kind of one-off things. The level of a type of secular cantata, there's some beautiful cantatas for betrothals or weddings, or there's one very beautiful piece which he reuses in a sacred context that was celebrating a beloved teacher at the university, things like that. And some of those librettos came from his favorite poets, that they were like Picander, where they would collaborate very closely. So there's evidence that he wanted to use more of his creative energy on secular projects, probably as a direct result of his frustrations in the liturgical context. So I'll say that much.
Yeah, just to add on a little bit, we know that it was shortly after this third Jahrgang where he redirected his focus and his efforts towards work with the Collegium Musicum, and that was when these drama per musicas, is what they were called, or secular cantatas, were written. And you mentioned Picander. A lot of those librettos were Picander librettos. We also know that in this third Jahrgang, there were a number of frustrations he had, but one was that the reliability of good libretti and people with whom he could collaborate. So perhaps he was, he had Picander he knew, and of course, St. Matthew Passion was just, 2 months after this? And so he had developed that relationship and liked that and put those efforts into some secular works. We also know that during this time of cantata writing, I don't know there's a lot of instrumental compositional output. I think the demands of the weekly cantatas, limited his other creative output. That picks up again after this third Jahrgang.
The part of your question about the political aspect, that's a little harder to be able to draw the threads from historical evidence. But a couple of other things that we can say is that when he's writing cantatas in these upcoming years, he's focusing much more on solo cantatas. So he'll feature a single soloist. A lot of the most well-beloved cantatas, including 84, which is a solo cantata for soprano that we'll be featuring on Sunday, and other great works like Ich habe genug, things like that, were composed, it seems, because he was trusting his forces less and less. And so he wanted to put the bulk of the musical work in the hands of a musician he trusted. You also see big instrumental symphonia starting cantatas, often with organ solo that his son would play. So it would be Wilhelm Friedmann, and then maybe a little bit later might be Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, a musician he knew he could trust, a musician he had trained. The other thing that we see in the early 30s is him really campaigning to get another job. And he tries, he has this ongoing conversation with the Elector of Saxony. Don't you really need a new Kapellmeister? And, I would be great. And he writes the Kyrie and the Gloria of the B minor Mass to audition for that job. And that music has great differences from the cantata writing. First of all, it's much more gallant. It's much more modern. It has a wealth of virtuoso parts that were designed for the musicians who were in Dresden, the great flutist Buffardin, the amazing violinist Pisendel, and many people speculate the most celebrated soprano in all of Europe, Faustina Bordone Hasse, the wife of the composer Hasse, and they were resident in Dresden. So that's a type of political commentary. He did get the appointment, but he didn't get the job. He got a title, but he was never hired, and he was never able to leave the job that he seemed to be less and less happy with in Leipzig to move to Dresden. We don't know what would have happened. Would he have started to compose operas as a resident, the Kapellmeister in the Dresden court? It's so intriguing to understand the path not taken.
Hi, everybody. Hi, everybody. My name is Ana Ospina. I am another cello fellow this year, and I have a question, not exactly about the cantata itself, but in general, like Bach's music. So we have talked about all of this week how strong the connection of his music is to like politics and society and all of these things, and I think that this week. Really working on the instrumental and voice music together, it really shows how much meaning and kind of like deep personal meaning all of his music has. And then especially when this is this type of music that we have the text and we have the context, the society context, it's kind of, we have like a direction and a goal for the musical things that we want to do. But I guess my question is directed to instrumentalists, that what would be one of the things that you would advise us or like suggest us to do when we're approaching the instrumental music from Bach that would guide us more or help us more to find that actual meaning when we don't have the words? And of course, like the harmonies and everything. But what would be a couple of suggestions?
I love that question. And I think that some of what we heard in the masterclass on Thursday night was all a beginning of that answer, because between our fellows and Heidi, we were, tell me what's happening, right? You know, what emotion are you going for? There's meaning everywhere, right? And I don't think that this cantata is a particularly good example of it, but sometimes we see where the music is going off in a different direction than the words. The words don't always tell us, don't say, this is what you're going to hear in the music, right? The music in Bach, as I think I said in my talk on Monday, is orthogonal, right? It's sort of at right angles to the text. It doesn't, sometimes it intersects, sometimes it goes off in its own direction. I think the work that we did this week and that Ryan and I are always trying to do is helping us look even closer at the music and say, tell me your secrets. What are you trying to show me? What are you trying to elicit in terms of a feeling and even a narrative? I think the beautiful suites and sonatas and partitas, the solo instruments, they all seem to carry all of this latent narrative to them. And the most exciting performances are when a player really sort of commits to that and allows the phrasing, the harmonies, the direction of the line to sort of pull us into places that we either recognize or even maybe we don't recognize. Oh, I wasn't expecting to go here, right? So, I think it's challenging, but I think that music is trying to convey meaning, and the question is how do we find the right tools to let that happen?
Briefly, I will just say that the best thing I think any musician can do, instrumentalist, singer, whatever, is to play with intent. And every phrase has intent. I often think about, I think one of the worst or most unfortunate advents in music are dynamics. Because they're an instruction. They're not an intent or an emotion or an objective. And I think so often young musicians will say, should I play this forte or mezzo forte, or what's the dynamic? I don't know. What's the intent behind it? And Bach especially, it's two sides of one coin. Everything he wants you to do is on the page. And there are so many things that aren't on the page that he's asking of you. And I think if you approach it with a sense of humility and honest intent, I had a teacher that used to tell me, lack of intent in the breath, when you breathe, translates to lack of color in the sound. And I think that's really important, especially for instrumentalists and string players that are often said, don't forget to breathe, don't forget to breathe. I think that is what Bach is always, I mean, all music, but especially Bach is asking that of us.
There was another, was there one more question? Okay, I think, thank you for your patience. And I just want to say a final thank you to all the hard work that our fellows have done over this entire stretch, and we are incredibly excited to be featuring them tomorrow morning in the service, and then again tomorrow evening in the final showcase concert. So I hope that you will all join us for that.